I was just a regular guy, living a life in the suburbs of New Jersey. Nothing too special, nothing out of the ordinary. I had my friends, my job, and weekends that consisted of barbecues and sports. But then I came across something that I'll never be able to explain, something that changed my life forever. I had always been skeptical about ghost stories, dismissing them as folklore or exaggeration. But what I experienced that night, well, I can't shake it, no matter how hard I try. It was a quiet Friday night in early October when it all started. My friend Ryan had invited me to join him and a few others for a late night walk through the old cemetery just outside town. People said it was haunted, and I knew the stories. Strange noises, cold spots, and shadowy figures lurking between the tombstones. But like I said, I wasn't one to believe in that kind of stuff. It sounded like nonsense to me. Come on, man, it's just a bit of fun. We'll scare ourselves, tell some spooky stories, and call it a night, Ryan said when I hesitated. A couple of beers and the thrill of being in a place that was supposedly haunted was too tempting to turn down. So I agreed. We met up at the cemetery entrance just past midnight. The air was cool, and the fog from the nearby river had begun to settle, rolling in thick tendrils over the ground. The gate was old, iron rusting and squeaking as we pushed it open. The gravestones were weathered, some nearly toppled over, while others were half buried in the ground. It wasn't the most inviting place at night, but I figured we'd make the best of it. There were 5 of us, Ryan, me, and 3 others, including Chris, who was the most eager to spook everyone. Come on, let's get to the old part. The one that's been abandoned for decades, he said, grinning. We made our way through the cemetery, the moon casting an eerie glow on the stones. The place was quiet, unnervingly quiet. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the crunch of dead leaves underfoot. As we walked deeper into the graveyard, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Maybe it was the stories I'd heard, or the fact that the silence felt unnatural, but something didn't sit right with me. Ryan tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes and telling stories about the history of the place. He mentioned an old legend that claimed the cemetery was cursed, that the souls of those buried there were restless, unable to find peace. I didn't believe it for a second. After all, if ghosts existed, wouldn't they show themselves more often? I figured it was all just superstition. We came to a large mausoleum near the center of the cemetery, its stone entrance cracked and covered in ivy. "This is the one," Chris whispered dramatically. "They say it's where the worst spirits are trapped. No one's gone inside for years." I rolled my eyes. "I think you've been watching too many horror movies, man." But we approached anyway because, well, I wasn't about to back down. The others seemed just as uneasy as I was, but no one wanted to admit it. We stood there in front of the mausoleum trying to get up the courage to enter. The air around us seemed to thicken and the temperature dropped suddenly. "All right, let's go," Ryan said, leading the way. He pushed open the door, which creaked loudly as it swung open. Inside, it was pitch dark. We fumbled around for our flashlights, and when the beams of light hit the walls, we saw the names of the deceased carved into the stone, long forgotten, but still there. That's when things started to feel wrong. As I stepped inside, the ground felt uneven beneath my feet, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. I glanced around, but something seemed off. It wasn't just the darkness. There was a strange sense of heaviness, like the very air was saturated with something I couldn't explain. Suddenly I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like someone or something was dragging itself across the stone floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned to the others, but they didn't seem to hear it. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. They all stared at me, confused. "What are you talking about?" Ryan asked, his face pale under the dim light. Before I could answer, the sound came again. This time it was closer. I could feel the vibrations in the air. My breath caught in my throat as the noise grew louder, like something crawling toward us. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw a shadow moving along the far wall. It was long and stretched unnaturally, like a figure that wasn't quite human. "Okay, that's enough," Chris said, his voice unsteady. "Let's get out of here." But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We all jumped back, and the air seemed to grow even colder. The temperature had dropped so much that I could see my breath in front of me, despite wearing a jacket. Something whispered. I couldn't make out the words, but it was there, echoing through the walls of the mausoleum. It wasn't any of us. I felt it, this cold, malevolent presence surrounding us. "Open the door! Open the door!" Ryan shouted, pulling on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I felt it. A hand. Cold, clammy fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I spun around, but no one was behind me. My heart raced, and I stumbled back toward the wall, my mind in a panic. The whispers grew louder. They sounded like they were coming from all around us, a cacophony of voices moaning and pleading. Some were angry, others sad. But there was one voice that stood out above the rest. It was a woman's voice, clear as day, whispering my name. Eric. I felt my stomach drop. My blood ran cold. I didn't know anyone buried here. I didn't know any of the names on the stones. But this voice was calling for me. I knew it. Eric, you shouldn't be here. I glanced at the others, but they looked as terrified as I felt. We were all trapped. It was as if the mausoleum itself had come alive, responding to our presence. The shadows around us seemed to move, shifting and twisting, as if trying to reach out and grab us. I saw someone, standing in the far corner of the room. A figure, cloaked in black, its face obscured by shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but the presence was overwhelming. It was as if the figure was watching us, waiting for us to make a move. "Run!" I screamed, turning to dash toward the door. We all bolted, pushing and shoving as we reached for the handle again. This time, it opened. We spilled out into the cemetery, gasping for air, hearts pounding. The cold night air felt like a balm against the panic that had taken over our bodies. But as we ran, I felt the unmistakable sensation that we were being followed. I glanced back, half expecting to see the figure from the mausoleum chasing us. Nothing. We didn't stop until we reached the cemetery gate. We were all breathless, scared out of our minds, but we didn't say much. Not at first. There were no jokes, no bravado, only silence. I tried to convince myself it was all just an illusion, a trick of the mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. That something had followed me out of that mausoleum. And the worst part? It's been weeks, and the whispers haven't stopped. At night, I hear them, faintly, like a breeze brushing through the trees. Eric? I don't know what happened that night, but I do know one thing for sure. Something dark and ancient is out there, and I've somehow become a part of its story.
Next story.
I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I know it sounds crazy, but I've experienced things that I can't explain. You'll probably think I'm just another person who fell victim to their own mind, but I swear, what happened to me in that cemetery is real. I know it's real because I can still hear the whispers when the wind blows too hard, and I can still feel the cold when I think about it. It all started last fall, when a group of my friends and I decided to explore a cemetery that was rumored to be haunted. There are stories about it. Stories that people pass around like ghostly gossip. They say it's cursed, that people who visit often encounter strange things, things that shouldn't be happening in the real world. But we were young, and we thought we were invincible. We thought it would be an adventure, something to talk about for years to come. The cemetery is old, really old. The tombstones are weathered, leaning, cracked. Some of the names are barely legible, washed away by decades of rain and time. Most of the people buried there date back to the 1800s, so it's not exactly a place you'd want to wander around at night, especially with the stories that people have told. Still, we were determined. It was Halloween weekend, and we thought it was the perfect time for a little thrill. We parked in front of the gate, and there was a weird feeling in the air, like something was off. I can't explain it, but I just felt unease, like I shouldn't be there. But I pushed the thought away. I wasn't about to let fear ruin my night. As we walked past the gates, the sound of crunching leaves underfoot seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The trees surrounding the cemetery swayed as if they were whispering to each other. There was no one around, not a single soul in sight. It felt like we were intruding on a place that was meant to be left alone. But we were determined, our curiosity stronger than any warning signs. We walked deeper into the cemetery, passing rows of graves and mausoleums. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting long shadows across the ground. As we ventured further in, we found ourselves in the oldest section of the cemetery, where the gravestones were in the worst shape. The air grew colder, and I felt a chill running down my spine. It was then that we saw it. There was an old crooked headstone, almost hidden in the overgrown grass. I'm not sure why we went over to it, but something about it called to us. Maybe it was the way the stone seemed to glow in the moonlight, or how the air around it felt charged with energy. Either way, we approached it. As I got closer, I could see the name carved into the stone, Margaret Sullivan. There was something eerie about that name, something I couldn't place. My friend, Jenny, always the brave one, reached out to touch the gravestone. The moment her fingers brushed the stone, the air shifted. It went from cold to freezing, as if a sudden gust of icy wind had hit us. The sound of leaves rustling grew louder, but the wind hadn't picked up. It was almost like the trees were talking, their branches swaying violently but without a breath of wind. "Is that normal?" I asked, my voice shaky. "No," Jenny said, backing away from the stone. That was weird." We all stood there for a moment, trying to rationalize what we had just experienced. And then something caught my eye. A figure. At the far end of the cemetery near the old chapel, I saw a shadow moving. It was tall and thin, but its features were indistinct. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could tell it wasn't a person. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. Jenny and the others looked in the direction I was pointing, but by the time they turned their heads, the figure had vanished. "Maybe it was just an animal or a shadow," Mark suggested, though I could tell he was trying to convince himself more than us. I wasn't so sure. Something about it felt wrong. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but before I could voice my concern, we heard something. A low, guttural sound coming from behind us. We all turned in unison, but there was no one there. The sound came again, closer this time, like footsteps dragging on the ground. Slow, deliberate. "Who's there?" Jenny called out, her voice echoing in the silent graveyard. There was no response. But the footsteps didn't stop. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and I could see the fear on the faces of my friends. Jenny, Mark, and the others were frozen in place, unsure of what to do. I could barely breathe. My chest tight as the sound of the footsteps grew louder. It was coming from the direction of Margaret Sullivan's grave. I turned toward the tombstone and my blood ran cold. The grave was no longer undisturbed. There, standing at the edge of the grave, was a figure. A woman, pale and gaunt, her face obscured by dark, tangled hair. She was dressed in a tattered white dress, as if she had been buried in it. And her eyes were hollow, empty pits that seemed to stare right through me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It was like I was paralyzed with fear. The woman began to walk toward us, her steps slow but purposeful. Her feet didn't touch the ground. They hovered just above it. I could hear the rustling of leaves as she passed through them, but her feet didn't make a sound. The cold around us intensified, and I saw my breath fogging in front of me. I don't know how long we stood there, unable to move, too terrified to even scream. But then, as if some unseen force had pulled the woman back, she suddenly vanished. She wasn't there anymore. Not even a trace. We ran. We didn't stop until we reached the gate. We didn't say a word to each other as we piled into the car and drove away. All I could hear was the sound of my racing heartbeat and the memory of those hollow eyes, staring, unblinking. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about Margaret Sullivan's grave. There was something wrong about it, something I couldn't put my finger on. That night, I decided to do some research on her. I found her obituary buried in an old newspaper archive. Margaret Sullivan had died young, in her 20s, back in 1882. They said she had been murdered, her body found in the cemetery, left in a pit near her family's grave. The authorities never found the killer. But that wasn't what shook me the most. At the bottom of the obituary, in tiny print, there was a note. Her ghost is said to haunt the cemetery where she was buried. I wish I had never gone back to that place. I wish I had never touched that gravestone. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what happened after we left. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in my house. They were slow, dragging, like someone was walking around my bedroom. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the footsteps grew closer to my bed. I could feel a presence standing just next to me, and when I opened my eyes, I saw her. Margaret Sullivan, standing in the corner of my room, her hollow eyes fixed on me. I haven't been able to sleep since then. I hear her sometimes, at night, just outside my window, her footsteps slow and deliberate, moving around the house. And sometimes, if I listen closely enough, I hear her whisper my name. I don't know how much longer I can live like this. Maybe it's my punishment for disturbing her grave. Maybe it's my fate to never be free from her presence. I don't know if I'll ever escape the terror of that cemetery, but I'll never forget the feeling of her cold, lifeless eyes watching me. And I know one thing for sure: Margaret Sullivan is still out there, waiting.
Next story.
I had never believed in ghosts, at least not until that night. I'd always thought those creepy stories were just that: stories. Tall tales whispered around campfires or exaggerated for the sake of scaring people. But after what happened to me in that old cemetery, my view of the world and of the things we can't see was changed forever. It all started when I was asked to help out with a local history project at my university. The assignment was to research the history of a place that had significance in the town's past. The older students recommended the local cemetery, which was established in the late 1700s. It was just on the outskirts of town, but it had a reputation for being haunted. I'd heard rumors about it before. People in the town whispered that strange things happened after dark: shadows that moved on their own, lights flickering out of nowhere, and even whispers in the wind. But I didn't take it seriously. I thought it was just a way to give the cemetery some character, to make it more interesting for tourists and ghost hunters. So when my professor assigned me to write a paper on it, I thought it would be a simple job. The cemetery was old, really old, and filled with graves that dated back to the early colonial era. I'd gone there a few times during the day to snap some photos and take notes, but I hadn't ventured there at night. That was something I intended to do for research purposes, of course. I figured that if the place was truly haunted, I'd get some first-hand experience to write about it. One chilly evening in early November, I decided to take a trip there after dark. It had rained earlier, and the ground was wet and slippery. I parked my car by the cemetery gate, the dim streetlights casting long shadows across the wet pavement. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, and the trees surrounding the cemetery creaked in the wind. I grabbed my camera and notebook and made my way inside, the rusted iron gate groaning as I pushed it open. The cemetery was eerily quiet. Not a sound of birds, no cars in the distance, just the sound of my footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The wind picked up, but it wasn't enough to explain the chill I felt creeping up my spine. I wasn't particularly scared, but there was something about the place that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the sheer age of the gravestones, or the fact that some of them were so old they were nearly illegible. The cemetery had a forgotten feel to it, like it had been abandoned by time itself. I wandered deeper into the graveyard, taking pictures of the stones and jotting down notes for my paper. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the scene. It was beautiful in a haunting way, but it also felt like something was watching me. I shook it off, trying to focus on my work. As I passed by an old mausoleum in the back corner, I noticed something strange. The door, which had always been shut during the day, was now slightly ajar. It was a small detail, but it caught my attention. I figured someone had left it open, though it seemed odd that the door would be unlocked so late at night. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to take a look inside. The inside of the mausoleum was dark, with only the light from my flashlight to guide me. The air was cold, musty, and thick with dust. I stepped inside carefully, my footsteps echoing against the stone walls. There were several old coffins lined up along the sides, and the floor was scattered with broken pieces of stone and remnants of old candles. The place felt abandoned, like no one had set foot inside for decades. But then I heard it. A low creak, followed by a soft thud. It sounded like something moving, or someone. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there, just the empty mausoleum. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating. I turned to leave, but as I stepped back toward the door, something caught my eye. A shadow. It was moving across the wall, though I hadn't seen anyone else in the mausoleum. The shadow was long, stretching unnaturally, like it didn't belong there. I froze, staring at it as it grew larger, as though it was inching closer to me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer, just silence. The shadow continued to move slowly, deliberately. Then I heard it, a faint whisper. It was barely audible, but I could make out one word: leave. I felt a cold hand of dread grip my heart. I don't know how I knew it, but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something in the air had shifted. The whisper wasn't from a person. It was something else. Something that wanted me to leave. I turned to run, but as I reached the door, it slammed shut with an incredible force. I stumbled back, falling to the floor, my flashlight clattering away. The door wouldn't open, no matter how hard I pulled on the handle. Panic began to set in. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could feel my chest tightening. The whispers came again, louder this time, echoing off the stone walls of the mausoleum. Leave. Now. I had no idea what was happening. My breath was ragged as I scrambled to my feet, trying to find my flashlight. I reached for it, but the shadow had grown larger, covering the entire wall now. It was no longer just a shape. It was a figure. A person, or something that looked like a person. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, its cold, malevolent energy. The figure started to move toward me, its footsteps slow but deliberate. I backed away, still struggling to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure came closer, and I could feel the temperature dropping. It was freezing now, the chill cutting through my jacket like ice. The whispers grew louder, blending into a cacophony of voices. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door suddenly flung open, throwing me back into the gravel path outside. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care if something was chasing me. I just ran. When I finally reached my car, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I could feel sweat dripping down my face despite the cold night air. I sat there for a long time, too scared to even look at the cemetery again. The next morning, I went back to the cemetery in the daylight, hoping it was all just a bad dream. But as I walked past the mausoleum, I noticed something I hadn't seen the night before: a fresh set of footprints in the wet ground leading into the building. The prints weren't mine. They were too large, too deliberate. They looked as though someone or something had been waiting for me. I never went back to that cemetery again. I finished my project, but I couldn't write about the history of the place the way I had planned. Instead, I wrote about what I saw, what I felt, and what I can never forget. And to this day, I still hear those whispers sometimes, faintly, just as I did that night. Leave.
Next story.
I had never been one to believe in the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, hauntings. Those were things that belonged in horror movies and creepy books, not real life. I grew up in a small town in Texas, and the local cemetery was just another stop on the map, a place people went to visit family, pay respects, or maybe stroll through on a Sunday afternoon. It wasn't until I took a job as a night security guard at that very cemetery that my view of the world changed forever. It wasn't glamorous work. The pay was low, and most of the time, the job was boring. I'd sit in the guard shack, drink coffee, listen to the radio, and wait for the occasional car to drive by. The cemetery had a reputation for being haunted, but like everyone else, I dismissed it as superstition. Old cemeteries are creepy by nature, and people tend to let their imaginations run wild. That all changed one night in late October. I had worked the night shift for a few weeks by then, and I was starting to get used to the quiet. The occasional animal would rustle in the bushes, or the wind would howl through the trees, but that was the extent of it, nothing out of the ordinary. But on that particular night, something felt different. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the usual rustling sounds seemed to have faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. I tried to brush it off. It's just the weather, I thought, adjusting my jacket. A little colder than usual, that's all. Around midnight, I made my rounds through the cemetery, checking the gates, the mausoleums, and the various paths that crisscrossed the grounds. It wasn't a large cemetery, but it was old, with trees that twisted in unnatural ways and gravestones that had been there for centuries. Most of the tombstones were worn down, names and dates nearly illegible from years of weathering. As I walked deeper into the cemetery, I noticed something strange. At the far corner, near the oldest section of the cemetery, one of the gravestones was glowing. It wasn't the soft glow of moonlight. No, this was different. It was a faint, unnatural blue light, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Curious but cautious, I made my way over to investigate. The closer I got, the brighter the glow became until I could clearly see the gravestone. It was an old one made of cracked stone with a name that I couldn't quite make out. The engraving was faint, almost like it had been scratched over with something sharp. But the most unnerving part was the glow. It seemed to be coming from the ground itself, as if something was buried beneath it. I knelt down and ran my hand over the stone. The air around me grew colder, and a strange feeling washed over me, like a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I traced the engraved letters, trying to make out the name. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "Help me." I shot up, my heart racing. My breath came out in short gasps, visible in the cold night air. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing nearby, but the cemetery was empty. The whisper had come from nowhere, and yet it felt as if it was all around me, pressing in on me from all directions. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no response, just the silence of the night. I backed away from the gravestone, my eyes darting around the cemetery, but everything appeared normal. The blue glow had faded, and the grave was just like all the others now, forgotten and weathered by time. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had probably misheard something. Maybe the wind had carried a sound from somewhere else, or maybe I was just tired. But as I turned to leave, I heard the whisper again. This time it was louder, closer. "Help me." I froze. My legs felt like lead, and my pulse quickened. It wasn't just in my head this time. It was real. The voice sounded desperate, and it was coming from somewhere beneath the ground, from the grave itself. Without thinking, I dropped to my knees and pressed my ear to the earth. The ground was cold and damp, and I could feel the vibrations of the whisper beneath me. The voice was clearer now, as if it were speaking directly into my ear. "Help me. Please." I didn't know what to do. I felt a strange compulsion to dig, to get to whatever or whoever was buried there. It was madness, I knew, but I couldn't help it. I grabbed a small trowel from my kit and began to dig. The soil was loose at first, but as I dug deeper, it became harder, as if something was resisting. My hands were covered in dirt, my arms aching, but I didn't stop. I had to know what was down there. After what felt like hours, I hit something hard. It wasn't a coffin or a stone, though. It was a metal box, rusted and worn, with strange symbols etched into its surface. The box was small, no bigger than a shoebox, and the metal was cold to the touch. But I could feel something else, something pulsing, something alive. I hesitated for a moment. What was I doing? This wasn't normal. This wasn't safe. But the voice kept calling to me, urging me to open the box. I had to see what was inside. I pried open the lid with trembling hands, and when it finally gave way, I recoiled in shock. Inside the box wasn't a body or any physical remains. Instead, there was a cloud of mist, thick and black, swirling inside the container. It seemed to have a life of its own, moving and shifting as if it were trying to escape. As soon as I opened the box, the mist began to pour out, and with it came the voices. Thousands of voices, all speaking at once, screaming, crying, begging for release. It was a chorus of torment, echoing in my ears and rattling my bones. The air turned frigid, and the ground beneath me began to tremble. The mist poured out faster now, swirling around me, filling my lungs with a foul, heavy air. I staggered backward, choking on the stench, but the voices grew louder. The mist clung to me, wrapping around my legs, pulling at my clothes. It was as though it had a hold on me, dragging me down into the earth. "Help me!" The voice whispered again, only this time it didn't sound like a plea. It sounded like a demand. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, unable to break free from the mist's grip. The cemetery around me seemed to vanish, replaced by a dark void with no end in sight. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The mist receded, the voices faded, and the ground stopped shaking. I was left standing in the cemetery, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The box was gone, and the grave was as it had been before. The night air was still, and the cemetery was silent once again. I didn't stay much longer that night. I ran back to the guard shack, and I never returned to that corner of the cemetery again. I quit my job shortly after, and I've never been able to explain what happened that night. I don't know who or what was in that grave, or why it called to me. But I know this: some things are better left undisturbed.
Next story.
I've always believed that some things are better left undisturbed. It's not because I'm superstitious, but because I've seen firsthand the consequences of curiosity. My name is Mark, and I was just an ordinary guy working an office job in a quiet suburb. Nothing ever really stood out about my life until I got a call from my old friend Peter. Peter and I hadn't kept in touch much after high school. He went off to college, and I stayed behind. But one day, out of nowhere, he called me up with an unusual request. "Mark," he said, his voice sounding strained, "I need you to help me with something. You remember that old house out in the woods, right? The one no one ever talks about?" I knew exactly which house he meant. It was an old, decaying mansion on the edge of town, far from any main roads. The house had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, and local legends had always surrounded it. People said it was cursed, that strange noises echoed from within the walls at night, and that anyone who dared to go inside never came back the same. But, of course, those were just stories, right? "I know the house," I said, trying to sound casual. "Why do you want to go there?" "There's something I need to find there. I can't explain it over the phone, but I need you with me." I wasn't thrilled about it. I had heard the stories, and deep down, I knew I didn't want to get involved in whatever strange thing Peter was obsessed with. But he was my friend, and I couldn't say no. "Fine," I agreed. "I'll meet you there." That night, we drove out to the house. The area surrounding it was thick with trees, and the road quickly gave way to an overgrown path. We parked our cars a little way from the house and walked the rest of the way in silence. The mansion loomed in the distance, an eerie silhouette against the dark sky. As we approached, I felt a strange unease in my chest. "I don't like this, Peter," I said, but he didn't respond. He was focused on the house, his eyes wide as if he had to be there. We reached the front door, which hung ajar, creaking in the wind. The inside of the house was shrouded in darkness, the air thick with dust and decay. Peter took a deep breath, stepped inside, and gestured for me to follow. "I've been here before," Peter said, almost to himself. "I've been looking for something." I hesitated. "What are you looking for?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he began to move through the house, searching the corners of the rooms, touching walls and floors as if he was trying to unlock some hidden secret. The old wooden floorboards creaked under our feet, and the sound echoed in the silence. I felt like we were intruding on something that didn't want to be disturbed. After what felt like hours of searching, Peter stopped in front of a door at the back of the house. It was small, tucked away in a corner behind a broken bookshelf. The door was locked, but Peter seemed to know exactly where to look. He pulled out a rusty old key from his pocket and unlocked it, the door creaking open with a groan. Inside was a small, dark room, lit only by the faint glow of our flashlights. The walls were lined with shelves that were nearly empty, except for a small wooden box sitting in the center of the floor. It was intricately carved, old but well preserved. Peter immediately moved toward it, his hands trembling as he knelt down to open it. "Peter," I said, my voice shaky, "what's inside?" But Peter was already opening the box. As he lifted the lid, a strange chill filled the room. I could see nothing but shadows dancing on the walls, but I felt something watching us. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Leave." It was barely audible, but it was there. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Peter didn't seem to hear it. He was too focused on what was inside the box. His eyes widened as he stared at whatever was hidden within, and a smile spread across his face, a smile that didn't seem like his own. "Peter?" I asked, my voice trembling. He turned to me, his eyes now completely wide and unblinking. There was something off about his expression, like he wasn't fully there. His lips barely moved as he spoke. "It's here," he said in a voice that wasn't quite his. "It's all here." Before I could ask what he meant, I noticed something in the corner of the room. A shadow, moving against the wall. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but then I saw it clearly. The shadow was too solid to be a trick of the light, too distinct to be just a figment of my imagination. And it wasn't alone. More shadows appeared, growing out of the walls, twisting and writhing like they were alive. I tried to back away, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The air grew thick and suffocating, and the temperature dropped dramatically. I couldn't breathe. The shadows moved closer, and I could hear the whisper again, this time much louder. Leave. I turned to Peter, but he was no longer himself. His face was slack, his expression empty. He was staring at the shadows as if they were pulling him in. I reached for him, shaking his shoulders. Peter, what's going on? You have to snap out of it. But it was no use. His body went limp in my arms, and I watched in horror as the shadows seemed to swallow him whole. He didn't scream. He didn't even fight. He simply disappeared into the darkness, leaving only a faint echo of his name behind. I don't know how I managed to get out of that room. My mind was a blur of terror and confusion, but somehow I stumbled back into the main hallway and bolted for the door. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air, feeling like I had narrowly escaped something far worse than death. The house behind me was silent once more, but I could still hear the whispers in my head. Leave. I haven't seen Peter since that night. I don't know what happened to him or why he was drawn to that cursed house. But I've heard rumors, whispers that the house is alive, that it pulls people in, claiming them one by one. It's been weeks, but I can still feel the chill when I think about it, and I'm certain that the house is waiting for me to return. And no matter how hard I try to forget it, the whispers follow me. They haunt me in my dreams, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I hear them even when I'm wide awake. Leave.
Next story.
It was late October when I decided to take a drive out to the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. I had always been intrigued by the eerie stories the locals whispered about it. The cemetery had been around for centuries, but it wasn't the age that drew me in. It was the rumors. They said it was haunted, that strange things happened there. People had gone missing, or worse, come back with stories of shadows in the trees, whispers in the wind, and sights that couldn't be explained. I was never one to believe in that sort of thing, but something about the chill in the air that night made me curious. I had to see it for myself. It wasn't hard to find. The cemetery was nestled on the edge of a thick forest, hidden behind rows of overgrown hedges. The iron gates creaked as I pushed them open, and I noticed immediately how still everything was. Unnaturally still. There were no animals, no insects, nothing to break the heavy silence. I had expected the place to be creepy, sure, but there was something off about the atmosphere. The air was damp and cold, and the graves, though old, were perfectly aligned, as though untouched by time. Some of the headstones were worn down to smooth, featureless stones, while others were in pristine condition, despite being centuries old. I walked deeper into the cemetery, feeling a strange sense of unease creeping up my spine. It felt as though the ground itself was watching me. The fog that had settled in the area gave the whole place an ethereal quality, as though I had stepped into another world. There was a particular grave that caught my attention, a large mausoleum that stood at the far end of the cemetery, isolated from the rest of the graves. Its stone walls were cracked, and the iron gate that surrounded it was rusted. But there was something about it that drew me in. I walked toward it, my footsteps crunching in the thick gravel beneath my feet. As I approached, I noticed the mausoleum was different from the others. It wasn't just old, it was unsettlingly out of place, like it didn't belong in the cemetery at all. The mausoleum's door was slightly ajar, and something about the way it creaked in the wind made my skin crawl. I pushed the door open, half expecting the sound of rustling or perhaps a sudden gust of wind. But there was nothing, just silence. The inside of the mausoleum was dark, save for the dim light filtering in through cracks in the stone. I could barely make out the shapes of old, weathered coffins arranged along the walls, their lids slightly askew, but it was one particular coffin in the center of the room that caught my attention. It was large, too large, and the name engraved on it made my blood run cold. David Winters. The name was familiar, but I couldn't place it right away. I had heard of the Winters family. They were one of the founding families of the town, but there hadn't been a David Winters for as long as anyone could remember. It was as if the name hadn't existed at all. Curiosity gnawed at me. I stepped closer, my heartbeat quickening, and then something strange happened. The air grew colder, and I could swear I heard a faint whisper. It was soft, like a breath, but distinct. It was calling my name. Elizabeth. I froze. My name wasn't Elizabeth. It was Laura. I spun around, searching the mausoleum for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The whispers continued, though. Now it sounded like more than one voice, several voices, all speaking in unison, their words a blur of overlapping sounds. Come closer, come closer. Against my better judgment, I found myself stepping closer to the coffin. I couldn't explain why I did it. There was a magnetic pull toward it, a force that I couldn't resist. The whispers grew louder with each step. When I reached the coffin, I noticed something odd. There were marks on the lid, scratch marks, as if something or someone had tried to claw their way out. The wood had been gouged deep, the scratches jagged and uneven. I reached out to touch the coffin, but before I could, the whispers stopped abruptly. Silence. The door to the mausoleum slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. My heart raced, and I immediately tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I felt as though I was suffocating in the dark, claustrophobic space, and for a moment, I thought I might lose my mind. Then the whispering returned, but this time it wasn't just voices. It was the sound of something else. Scratching, like nails against stone. I looked down at the coffin, horrified to see the scratches on the lid, moving, shifting, as if something inside was trying to escape. The wood groaned and creaked, and the entire mausoleum seemed to tremble. I backed away, but I couldn't look away. It was as if my body was frozen, trapped in some invisible force. The coffin's lid slowly began to rise, and a low growl echoed from within. The air turned heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth. I felt sick, my stomach churning with the realization that something was emerging from the coffin. And then it came. A hand, pale and skeletal, reached out from the coffin. The skin was stretched thin over brittle bone, the fingers long and twisted, as though it had been dead for years. I screamed and stumbled backward, my breath coming in gasps. The thing dragged itself out of the coffin, its body stiff and jerky, as though it had been lying there for centuries. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were grotesque, its face a writhing mass of scars and decay. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stare straight through me. It opened its mouth, and the air around me seemed to grow colder. A deep, guttural voice echoed in my mind. Leave or join us. Without thinking, I bolted for the door again, this time managing to break it open. I ran out into the fog, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing behind me. I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, speeding away from that cursed place. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know who or what David Winters was, or why he was buried in that mausoleum. But I do know this. There are things in that cemetery that shouldn't be disturbed. And whatever it was that I encountered, it wasn't something of this world. I haven't told anyone about what happened. I'm too afraid they'll think I'm crazy. But I swear, there's something wrong with that cemetery. I've driven by it since, and every time I feel that same cold shiver down my spine. I don't know what waits there, but I do know one thing. I will never ever go back.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. In fact, I used to make fun of people who did. That is, until I took that job at the old Ashford Manor. Ashford Manor was a crumbling mansion at the edge of town, abandoned for decades. It was a place that every local child had dared each other to go near after dark. The rumors surrounding it were legendary. A wealthy family that disappeared without a trace, strange lights in the windows, and the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the empty halls. But all of that was nonsense. Or at least, I thought so. I was a private investigator, hired to look into the old manor's history for a new owner who wanted to buy it and restore it. The previous owner had died under mysterious circumstances, and the house had stood vacant for over 30 years. My job was to gather information, verify the history, and determine if there was any truth to the rumors. I wasn't thrilled about it. Ashford Manor was deep in the woods, far from any real help, and the idea of spending nights in that decrepit place didn't sound appealing. But the money was good, and I wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. So I accepted the job and started my research, diving into old records and newspapers, trying to piece together the house's story. What I found was unsettling. The Ashford family, as the rumors suggested, had mysteriously disappeared one night in the 1920s. The local police had investigated but found no trace of them, no bodies, no evidence of foul play. Some people believed they'd simply packed up and left in the middle of the night, but Others whispered that something more sinister had happened. The reports mentioned strange occurrences in the house before their disappearance. Doors opening on their own, strange noises in the walls, and sightings of shadowy figures in the windows. But nothing conclusive ever came from the investigation. The case was left open, and the house was abandoned. I decided to spend a few nights there, trying to uncover more. I arrived at the manor just as the sun was setting. The house was even more eerie in person, its once grand facade now covered in ivy, the windows cracked and dark. I stepped through the front door, which creaked ominously as it opened. The air inside was stale, the floors covered in dust, and everything seemed frozen in time. I set up camp in one of the larger rooms, a parlor that overlooked the front lawn. There was no electricity, so I used a lantern for light. The silence was suffocating, and I could feel the weight of the house pressing in on me. The longer I stayed, the more uncomfortable I became. That first night, nothing happened. No footsteps, no whispers, just the occasional creak of the old house settling. I had a restless sleep, but nothing out of the ordinary. The next day, I continued my research, combing through old family portraits and diaries left behind. The Ashfords had been a wealthy family, once well respected in the community, but the deeper I dug, the more I felt like something was watching me. By the third night, I had nearly convinced myself that the whole thing was a waste of time. But something was off. There was a subtle change in the air. The house felt alive, as if it were breathing, watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I was sure I was the only person there. Around midnight, I decided to explore the upstairs. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, and the hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and empty. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe a hidden room, a clue, something to explain the house's mysterious history. But as I walked past the rooms, I couldn't help but notice that one door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. I approached cautiously, my lantern casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The door opened with a soft creak as I pushed it. Inside was a bedroom, its furnishings long since decayed. But what caught my attention was the large, ornate mirror on the far wall. It was cracked, the glass dull, dark, but still reflecting the dim light of my lantern. I stared at the mirror for a moment, feeling a strange pull towards it. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but when I turned my head, I saw it again. A figure, standing in the mirror's reflection. It wasn't a person. It was more like a shadow, an outline of something tall and thin, with no features. But I could feel it, its presence, its gaze fixed on me. I turned quickly, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest. I looked back at the mirror, but now there was nothing. The figure was gone. I tried to shake it off, but a cold shiver ran down my spine. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't. I stepped closer to the mirror, my breath visible in the cold air. Suddenly, the reflection changed. The room in the mirror was no longer empty. The furniture was intact, the bed perfectly made, and standing in front of the mirror was a woman. She had long, dark hair, and her eyes were wide with terror. She was staring directly at me, her mouth open in a silent scream. But the most unsettling part, her reflection was moving. She began to raise a hand, slowly, as if reaching for me. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, and then, without warning, her fingers pressed against the glass, leaving behind streaks of blood. I staggered back, gasping, but the woman in the mirror didn't move. She remained frozen, her bloodied hand pressed against the glass. Then, in a voice that wasn't hers, a voice that came from all around me, I heard a whisper. "Get out!" I spun around, panic surging through me, but the room was empty. The air was heavy with a presence that made my skin crawl. The door slammed shut behind me, and I felt a sudden rush of wind, cold and sharp, sweep through the hallway. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in that house. I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste to escape, and bolted out the front door. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, but I managed to start the engine. As I drove away from Ashford Manor, I looked in the rearview mirror. The house stood dark and silent in the distance, but I could swear I saw something in one of the upstairs windows, a shadow moving behind the glass, watching me. I never went back. The job was over, But the terror I felt that night stayed with me. I've tried to forget it, but I still hear her voice sometimes, soft and pleading. Get out. I don't know who she was or why she reached out to me, but I do know one thing. Ashford Manor is no place for the living.
Next story.
I had never been one to believe in ghosts or supernatural things. That is, until one cold fall evening when I found myself standing at the edge of a cemetery. I had grown up in a small town in Kentucky, a place where the leaves fell in thick carpets and the fog seemed to settle on the ground like a living thing. The cemetery was old, really old. My grandmother used to tell me that it had been there for over 200 years, ever since the first settlers came to the area. The graves were sunken and worn, many of the tombstones unreadable from age, the names and dates lost to time. It was around dusk when I decided to go there. My friends dared me to, and I, of course, thought it would be funny to show them that I wasn't afraid. It's just a bunch of old stones, I had laughed, shrugging off the strange warnings from the locals. People around here always had ghost stories about the cemetery. They said things like, if you stand in front of the old Harris tombstone at midnight, you'll hear the voices of the dead. And don't go near the statue of the angel, it's cursed. Of course, I didn't believe a word of it. But as I walked past the iron gate and stepped onto the uneven ground, the air seemed to grow thicker. The wind had started to pick up, and I could hear it whispering through the trees, the leaves rustling like they were trying to say something. I took a few steps in, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, and that's when I noticed it. A shadow. It was moving along the path ahead of me, and I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light. But as I drew closer, I realized it was a figure, a person, standing still in the middle of the cemetery. At first, I thought it was just another visitor, someone who had come to pay their respects. But something about the way they stood, so perfectly still, gave me a chill. Hey, are you okay? I called out, my voice coming out more nervous than I intended. No answer. I started walking toward them, slowly, keeping my distance. The figure didn't move an inch. It was as if they were frozen, staring at the ground. When I was about 10 feet away, I could see them more clearly. They were wearing an old-fashioned outfit, a black dress with lace, long sleeves, and a bonnet that covered their face. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized they were standing right in front of one of the oldest graves in the cemetery, the Harris tombstone. Hello? I called again, this time more firmly. Still, no response. I reached out a hand, thinking maybe they hadn't heard me. Just as my fingers were about to touch their shoulder, the figure turned around slowly, and my heart nearly stopped. Their face, if you could call it a face, was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. There was no emotion there, just an empty gaze. The lips were cracked, almost rotted, and the skin was stretched thin across their skull. The worst part was the smell, a rotting stench that made my stomach churn. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place. That's when I heard it. Whispers. Low at first, barely audible, but growing louder by the second. They seemed to be coming from all around me, like the ground itself was speaking. I turned my head in every direction, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing. Just the cold, still air. The whispers turned into words, slowly forming phrases, each one more terrifying than the last. Leave, now. Don't look at it. Run, or stay, but it will claim you. The voice was disjointed, as if more than one person was speaking at once. I felt the hair on my neck stand up, and my heart pounded in my chest. The figure in front of me was still staring, but it was as if the whispers were coming from it too. I glanced at the Harris tombstone behind the figure, and that's when I saw it. A name. It was faint, almost invisible at first, but as I focused, it became clearer. Elizabeth Harris. I had heard the stories about Elizabeth. She was the daughter of one of the first settlers in the area, and she had died under strange circumstances. Some said she had died in childbirth. Others said it was an accident. But the rumors about her grave were always the same. People claimed that she didn't rest in peace, that her spirit had never left the cemetery. And now, I was standing right in front of her tombstone, with her ghost staring me down. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. The air grew colder, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. I turned to leave, but the figure stepped forward, blocking my way. You can't leave. I took a step back, my pulse racing. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure began to reach out towards me, its fingers twitching, and in that moment I realized what it wanted. I felt the ground beneath me give way. My feet were no longer on solid earth, but sinking as if the ground was swallowing me whole. I looked down and saw the soil shifting, pulling me down into the darkness. Panic surged through me as I struggled to break free, but the more I fought, the faster I seemed to sink. I could still hear the figure's whispers, louder now, echoing in my ears. Stay with us. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. My chest tightened, and I was suffocating. The earth seemed to close in around me, and I realized with horror that I wasn't just sinking into the ground. I was being dragged down into a grave. Suddenly, everything stopped. The whispers faded. The ground stopped pulling me. I was still standing, my feet solid on the ground, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I turned to look, and the figure was gone. The tombstone of Elizabeth Harris was still there, standing silent and still, as if nothing had happened. The cemetery was quiet again. But I knew something had changed. I didn't wait to find out what that change was. I ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the cemetery and back on the road, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I haven't been back to that cemetery since, and I don't ever plan to go back. But the whispers still haunt me. Every time I close my eyes, I hear them, soft, almost like a lullaby, calling me to return. Sometimes, when I pass by the cemetery, I feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, as if I'm being watched. And I know I'll never forget what I saw that night. Elizabeth Harris isn't gone, and neither is the cemetery. It's still there, waiting.
Next story.
I wasn't expecting it to happen. To be honest, I thought ghost stories were just for fun, something to tell around a campfire or on a late-night drive. But that all changed when I found myself standing in the middle of a cemetery that I never should have stepped foot in. It all started last summer when I visited my cousin, Matt. He'd just moved to a small town in New England, a place that seemed almost frozen in time. The streets were narrow, the houses old, and the people quiet. Matt was always up for an adventure, so when I arrived, he suggested we check out the local cemetery. "It's supposed to be haunted," he said with a grin. I laughed, brushing off his comment. I was a skeptic, always needing logical explanations for everything. But Matt, he was a bit of a thrill seeker. He wanted to do something out of the ordinary, so I reluctantly agreed. The cemetery was on the outskirts of town, hidden behind overgrown trees and thick fog that never seemed to lift. As we walked through the iron gate, I noticed how eerie it felt, how every step seemed to disturb the silence in a way that made me uncomfortable. The gravestones were ancient, some cracked with age, others leaning as if the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. "See anything interesting?" Matt asked, pulling me from my thoughts. I glanced around. The cemetery was definitely old, but it didn't look like anything special. "Just a bunch of old tombstones. Nothing that screams haunted," I replied with a shrug. We wandered deeper, passing rows of graves, some covered in moss, others buried under piles of leaves. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no sounds of traffic or people. It felt like we were the last living souls in the world. And then I saw it. At the far end of the cemetery, almost hidden by a large oak tree, there was a weathered headstone. It was different from the others. It wasn't broken or leaning. In fact, it stood upright, almost as if it had been cared for, even though it looked centuries old. The name on the stone read Catherine Harrow. I walked closer to get a better look. There was something strange about it, something that drew me in. The name itself sounded familiar, but I couldn't place why. Matt, sensing my hesitation, came up beside me. "What do you think? Looks like a normal grave to me." I shook my head. "I don't know. It just feels different." I reached out to touch the stone, and as soon as my fingers brushed against it, the temperature around me seemed to drop. It wasn't just a chill in the air, it felt like the very life in the cemetery had been drained. "Do you feel that?" I asked, my voice low. But Matt was already a few steps ahead, not noticing the change in the atmosphere. Suddenly, I heard it. A faint sound, almost like whispers. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. "Matt, I think we should go," I said, the unease growing within me. He laughed. You're not scared, are you? It's just a cemetery. Let's stay a bit longer. This is the spot that everyone talks about. Before I could respond, I saw something move from the corner of my eye. It was quick, just a flash of movement between the tombstones. Did you see that? I asked, voice shaky. Matt looked at me like I was losing it. Probably just a raccoon or something, he said, waving it off. But I knew it wasn't. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The whispers grew louder, but no one was around. And then I felt it, a presence. It wasn't physical, but it was there, surrounding me. It felt cold, like something was watching. I turned back toward Catherine Harrow's grave, and this time I noticed something new. The engraving on the stone was different. The name hadn't changed, but there was now a faint line under Catherine Harrow, a year, 1853. The air shifted again, heavier this time, as if the weight of the entire cemetery was pressing down on us. And then, just like that, the whispers stopped. Everything went dead quiet. I looked at Matt, whose face had gone pale. "We need to go," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't argue. We turned to leave, but just as we reached the gate, something stopped us. A figure. It was a woman, standing at the edge of the cemetery, just beyond the rows of gravestones. Her face was obscured by a veil, but I could see her silhouette, her outline clear against the moonlit sky. She was dressed in a long, dark gown, and her feet didn't seem to touch the ground as she glided toward us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Matt grabbed my arm. "Run!" he shouted, pulling me toward the exit. But the figure was faster. She blocked our path before we could take another step. I could feel her presence now, an overwhelming sense of grief and rage. It was like the air itself became thick with sorrow, suffocating us. The whispers returned, louder this time, and I could hear the words clearly. "Leave. This is my resting place." The woman's voice was soft but filled with an ancient bitterness. She reached toward us, her hands like icy claws. I didn't wait to find out what she wanted. We sprinted toward the gate, heart pounding, adrenaline rushing through my veins. But as we ran, I could hear the whispers following us, the coldness pressing in from all sides. When we finally reached Matt's car, we didn't look back. We drove away in silence, the chill from the cemetery still clinging to my skin. My mind raced as I tried to process what had just happened. Who was Catherine Harrow? Why was she still there, haunting the graveyard all these years? It wasn't until we were miles away that the air seemed to return to normal. The whispers faded, and the coldness finally left my bones. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that night, unable to sleep, I did some research on the cemetery. I found a local legend about a woman named Catherine Harrow. She had died in 1853, but not from natural causes. The story said she had been wrongfully accused of witchcraft, and after her execution, her body was buried in that cemetery. It was said that her spirit never found peace, forever trapped in the place where she was condemned to die. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that cemetery. I don't know if it's the ghost of Catherine Harrow that still haunts it or something else. But I do know one thing for sure: whatever was there that night, it wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real. And it's waiting for anyone brave enough to step into that cemetery again.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. In fact, I used to mock people who did. That is, until I had an experience that shattered everything I thought I knew. The night I spent in Hollow Creek Cemetery changed my life forever. It all started with a dare. My friends and I had been bored one Friday night and decided to challenge each other to do something crazy. One of them, Nick, was always the one pushing us to take risks. He suggested we go to Hollow Creek Cemetery. It was about 20 minutes outside of town, and everyone knew about the weird stories surrounding it. Rumors said that it was haunted by the spirits of people who had died in mysterious ways, and no one ever went there at night. Naturally, that was enough to get us all intrigued. We drove out there, my car's headlights barely cutting through the fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. As we pulled up to the old iron gates, a chill ran down my spine. The cemetery looked like something straight out of a horror movie, old, dilapidated, and abandoned. The trees surrounding it seemed to stretch their bare branches toward the sky like twisted arms, and the gravestones were worn down and cracked, some of them tipped over. "All right, let's get this over with," Nick said, smirking. "Who's first?" We all hesitated, but there was no way we could back out now. One by one, we climbed out of the car, the sound of gravel crunching under our feet oddly loud in the quiet night. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp earth, and I felt an inexplicable sense of unease settling in my stomach. Nick led the way, striding confidently through the cemetery. I followed close behind, trying to convince myself that it was just an old, forgotten graveyard. Nothing more. We walked past rows of graves, most of them unreadable due to the years of weathering, and entered the older part of the cemetery. This area was more overgrown, the tombstones almost swallowed by the thick grass and ivy. It was then that I noticed it. At the far end of the cemetery, behind a cluster of trees, there was a large mausoleum. Its door was cracked open, and it looked like no one had touched it in years. The air around it seemed different, heavy, oppressive. It wasn't just the decay of the place that made it unsettling. It was something else, something that I couldn't explain. "I dare you to go in," Nick said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. I turned to see him grinning, clearly enjoying my discomfort. The others were looking at me too, waiting for me to take the challenge. There was no way I could back down. I wasn't going to let them think I was scared. "Fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go in." I made my way toward the mausoleum, each step feeling like it took me deeper into something that didn't belong in this world. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the smell of dampness and decay hitting me like a wall. Inside, the darkness was thick and heavy, the air cold and stale. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't turn back. I had to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid. I stepped inside, my eyes straining to see anything in the oppressive blackness. And that's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was like the whisper of fabric moving in the wind. But there was no wind. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned toward the sound, my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking despite my efforts to sound confident. There was no answer. But then I felt it, a cold, icy sensation creeping over me, wrapping itself around my body like a tightening grip. The air grew heavier, thicker. My breathing became shallow, labored, as if the very atmosphere of the mausoleum was suffocating me. I stumbled back toward the door, my hand outstretched in the dark, but I couldn't find the way out. The door had vanished. It was like the walls of the mausoleum had closed in on me, trapping me inside. That's when I saw her, a figure in the darkness, standing perfectly still. She was tall, her hair long and dark, hanging like a veil around her face. Her eyes glowed faintly, two pools of white that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Her clothes were tattered, as though she had been wandering through the earth for years. She didn't move, but I could feel her presence like a weight pressing down on me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, she began to move toward me, her feet making no sound on the stone floor. The closer she got, the colder it became. I could see her features now, her skin pale and almost translucent, her mouth twisted into a slight, sorrowful frown. I backed away, panic rising in my chest. "What do you want?" But the figure didn't speak. She reached out, her cold fingers brushing against my face. I gasped, the chill sinking into my skin, as if her touch was freezing me from the inside out. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. I don't remember running out of the mausoleum. I don't remember how I got back to the car, but when I opened my eyes, I was sitting in the driver's seat, gasping for breath. My friends were looking at me, their faces filled with concern. "You okay?" Nick asked, his usual bravado gone, replaced by genuine worry. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was okay at all. Something had changed. I could still feel the coldness of her touch on my skin, still hear the echo of her silent presence in my mind. The figure in the mausoleum hadn't been a figment of my imagination. She was real. When I got home that night, I tried to forget what had happened. But the next few days, strange things started happening. I would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling the cold sensation creeping over me. I would hear whispers in the dark, soft and unintelligible. And every time I closed my eyes, I could see the woman's glowing eyes staring at me from the shadows. I went back to the cemetery the following week, hoping to find some answers. But when I reached the mausoleum, it was gone. The area was completely empty, as if it had never existed. No stone, no walls, no sign of the building that had once been there. I never went back after that. I don't know who she was or what she wanted, but I know this much. Some places are cursed, and some spirits are bound to them forever. And once you've met one, you can never truly escape.
Next story.
I had never believed in ghosts. In fact, I prided myself on being a skeptic. I was a scientist, someone who valued logic and reason above all else. But then there was that night, the night that changed everything. It started innocently enough. A friend of mine, Jack, had invited me out for a drive. He was one of those types who loved urban exploration, the kind who sought out abandoned places for the thrill of it. He'd been talking for weeks about an old cemetery just outside of town, the kind that nobody visited anymore. The locals all said it was dangerous, that strange things had happened there, but Jack wasn't one for superstition, and neither was I. We decided to check it out one evening, around dusk. The cemetery was located on the edge of town, hidden deep within a forest. It was a place I had heard about growing up, but had never really paid attention to. It was too far out, too overgrown, and most importantly, it wasn't the kind of place anyone went, unless they had a particular reason to. When we arrived, I was struck by how quiet it was. The trees surrounding the cemetery were so thick that the last of the evening light barely made it through. The only sound was the crunch of the gravel beneath our feet as we approached the iron gate, which was rusted and half hanging off its hinges. Jack pulled out a flashlight from his backpack and started shining it across the old headstones. "This place is ancient," he said with excitement. "Look at the dates on these graves. Some of these people died more than 100 years ago. I bet there are stories here." I wasn't as enthusiastic. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, something that made my skin crawl. But I figured I was just letting my imagination run wild, as I often did in places like this. We walked deeper into the cemetery, the gravestones leaning at odd angles, and the fog rolling in thicker as night began to settle. It wasn't long before Jack stopped in front of one particular grave. The stone was cracked and weathered, but what struck me was the name carved into it: Eliza Montgomery. There was something about it that seemed to linger in the air, an unspoken heaviness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just an old grave, but there was something about it that felt wrong. Jack, oblivious to my discomfort, pulled out his camera and started taking pictures. "This is the one," he said, as he focused on the inscription. "There's a legend about Eliza Montgomery. They say she was the last person buried here and that she didn't die naturally." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, didn't die naturally?" Jack looked at me, a little too excited for my taste. "They say she was killed. Murdered, actually. No one knows by whom, but there are stories that say she was buried alive, that her family buried her, thinking she was dead, but she woke up in the coffin. Ever since then, people have reported hearing things near her grave, voices, screams, knocking on the ground." I shook my head, laughing nervously. "Come on, Jack, you know I don't believe in that kind of stuff." But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that grave. The air around it felt thicker somehow, and I could have sworn I heard a faint scratching noise coming from beneath the ground. I glanced at Jack, who was still busy taking photos, and dismissed it as my mind playing tricks on me. But that's when I heard it again, a faint tapping like something was scraping against the stone. My heart skipped a beat. "Jack," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Did you hear that?" Jack paused, his camera still raised, and turned to look at me. "Hear what?" "There's something down there," I said, nodding toward the grave. Jack gave me an incredulous look. "You're just spooked. It's probably just a rat or something. Let's move on." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and I noticed a fog beginning to roll in thicker than before, cloaking the gravestones in an unnatural mist. I felt a sharp chill run down my spine as the tapping noise grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a rat, it was a knock from beneath the earth. "Jack, we need to go," I said, my voice urgent. Jack turned to face me, his expression one of annoyance. "Relax, man, it's just a story. Come on, we're here now, let's explore." Before I could protest, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't a natural shadow like the ones cast by trees or gravestones. This shadow moved on its own, sliding across the ground toward us, low to the earth. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow seemed to take shape, growing taller, like a figure emerging from the mist. Jack! I shouted, grabbing his arm. Jack didn't respond. His eyes were glued to the shadow, his body frozen in place. It was as if he couldn't move, couldn't tear his gaze away from whatever it was that was emerging from the fog. And then I saw it, the figure. It was a woman, but not in any way I could describe as human. Her skin was pale and stretched tight over her bones, her eyes black voids. Her hair hung in tangled, matted clumps, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. She took one slow step toward us, and that's when the whispers started. Low at first, like distant voices, but then growing louder, surrounding us. Help me, they pleaded. Free me from the grave. I turned and ran, pulling Jack along with me, but he didn't move. He was still staring at the figure, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I could see his lips moving, but the whispers from the figure drowned everything else out. I don't remember much after that. I must have dragged Jack back to the car, but everything after the moment we turned to run is a blur. The next thing I remember is waking up at home, sweating, my heart racing, but there was no sign of Jack. I've called him 100 times, but every time I reach his voicemail. It's been a week since that night, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something is watching me. The whispers still follow me, like a shadow trailing just behind me. I don't know if Jack is okay, if he's still out there somewhere, or if that woman's spirit has taken him. But I know this, whatever we disturbed that night, it wasn't a story. It was real. And it's not over.